Posted by you/Foxies. Psychologists of Reddit, have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story? Clinical psychologist here. I used to work in a prison and did a parole evaluation for an inmate that was a high-ranking gang member in a national gang. By his account, he was the highest ranking in the state. In fact, he was placed in that prison to hold his people accountable and keep the peace. He had a long violent record and was, in my opinion, a genuine psychopath. Part of the eval is discussing the crime and assessing remorse and whatnot. He was so clinical in his description of how he tortured and left this guy to die over an unpaid debt. Live by the sword, die by the sword was his phraseology for the act. Like it was nothing. He was also very nonchalant about his ability to take care of his business while inside. I believed him. He had only spent 18 months of his last 15 years outside of prison. My recommendation was not to parole him. There were various factors that I gave, and in the end the parole board went with my recommendation. So the part that actually scared me, this was my first parole eval, was this guy's ability to affect the world outside. He could have sent someone to my house if he wanted to. I had no doubt about that. More experienced psychologists told me not to worry about it. That he knew the score and wouldn't take it personally. I had a hard time buying it. I was running a long-term offender group a few months later and he was part of it. After the first group, I pulled him aside and asked if we were good. He smiled at me and told me not to worry. I did my job and he didn't blame me for writing what I did because it was true. He went on to be a really insightful and active group member. Not a psychologist, but I used to work in a psych ward as security. We had this huge guy with schizophrenia detained in ones, which is the ward for those who have been legally determined to be unfit and are not allowed to leave. When I say huge, I mean he was like 6 feet 5 inches, gigantic muscles, and he used to be an MMA fighter. Real nice guy when medicated, but when in psychosis, he was not someone you'd want to go toe-to-toe with. We would sometimes have to call police to help us deal with him. One officer would arrive, take a look at him and go nope and call for backup. So one day I was guarding the entrance to ones. He was doing fairly okay, so he wasn't confined to his room and was allowed to walk around the supervised communal space. He puts down his magazine, goes into his room and then walks out naked. Dude walks up to me, stands about an inch away and looks down at me. I mean way down, as I'm only 5 feet 3 inches. He tells me he's leaving. I asked if he would like some shoes or a gown. He says no, he's leaving and I better step aside, so I did. You better believe I stepped the fuck aside and let him walk out. I followed him at a safe distance through the psych ward, where everyone basically pinned themselves against the wall to get away, and out into the parking lot while on the call with the cops. I can't leave the grounds, so once he was off hospital property, I could only inform the police to which way he was running, which was down into a heavily populated downtown core. Not even 15 minutes later, he comes back and walks back into the lobby of the ward and asks for me. He wants shoes after all. Not a robe, but shoes. So I bring him shoes to prevent him from getting violent, and off he goes again as I repeat the process, following him to the edge of the grounds and calling the cops. Cops bring him back and put him into his secure room. However, once he is in there, they are not allowed to restrain past a certain point. So the whole security team assembles, which is me and about 5 men. They decide I'm to hold a leg as I'm small and legs are easier to restrain. So we go into the room in a triangle formation with me as the last to enter. He must have missed when I came in the door, because he started screaming that I was a shapeshifter and freaking out. It took us about 30 minutes of restraining him before he was medicated enough to calm down. Fast forward maybe 2 years later. I'm no longer security or live in the town, but I went for a metal show. I joked to friends that I was worried someone I had dealt with in the hospital might recognize me and have bad memories. Lo and behold, there is MMA fighter taking shots at the bar. Now I know that he shouldn't be drinking with his meds, but hey, it's been 2 years and I don't know anything about his current health status, so whatever. I still tried to avoid him in case he remembered my shape-shifting. At one point our lines to the bar coincided, and I ended up standing next to him. He looked up at me, looked down and then looked back up and stared hard. I could tell he recognized me, but I could also tell that he was trying to figure out from where. The entire night I could see him lingering around me, staring with this befuddled expression on his face. I was a tad scared. When I was studying psychology my final year, I had the opportunity to meet with convicted felons. Essentially, I sat down and spoke to a man, in his 30s-ish, who was a sexual offender. He told me he used to marry women and then rape their young daughters. Each was in the range of 6 to 7 years old. I listened to him explain it. It was literally my instructions not to judge them. I had to sign a waiver to not get emotional. So I asked him about the home life of those he abused. He'd say that some of the women he married had other children, and in one case there was an older sister who was 13, but he would never ever touch her. He'd drop her off at school, where he told me he was never into any of the children he saw, and take her to practice in friend's house, and while she was gone, he'd go back and rape her 6-year-old sister. He told me that it really isn't always about being attracted to prepubescent girls, it's about the dominance and power that come with having sex with them. Hess being rehabilitated now though. Weird part was that I wasn't sure if he was acting remorseful, BC if he was, he is amazing at it. He was just very open to my questions and expressed regret, and I almost believed him. However, when I met a man who was convicted of child porn, his I feel terribles were transparent and so full of shit it was disgusting. My professors warned me about manipulation, so that was easy to catch on to, but with the previous guy? He was either an impeccable liar and manipulator, or he genuinely wanted to get better, crazy. A very sweet, mostly blind teenager who was going through his first psychotic break and had a love of martial arts, taekwondo, if I remember correctly, was really good at it. He couldn't see and would practice kicks, and at one point, accidentally kicked one of the reinforced shatterproof windows in the quiet room. Think padded room without the padding. Turns out they were shatter resistant, he destroyed it with that kick. Why those particular details? Because he would practice his kicks everywhere, was mostly blind, and the one time he flipped up to practice one and I was walking around the corner, it came literal centimeters from my face, and I felt the impact of it against the air, like a physical force bashing into my face. Sweetest kid in the world, he would have been horrified if it had connected, because things would have broken. A lot of things. He also grabbed my arm once in a suddenly firm grasp and asked if I wanted to do taekwondo with him. No, I did not. Not a psychologist, but saw a breakdown in my ex that scared me senseless. He had just started meds and the meds reacted horribly with him for whatever reason. He mostly had hallucinations, but sometimes he'd black out and do activities and not remember them. He would call me screaming at 3 a.m. and he didn't remember a second of it. Any of it. He had hallucinations before, but they got increasingly dangerous with these meds. In particular, I think of one instance. While on the phone during an episode, he said, "I boiled some water." I asked why, as it was 3 a.m., and he replied eerily calmly, "They told me I have to stick my hand in here." It was absolutely terrifying. I finally begged him to go to the hospital that following morning to ask for a medication change, and he begrudgingly obliged. While he was there, he started throwing up blood and had to get his stomach pumped. Turns out, in one of his blackouts, he swallowed his entire bottle of medication. I'm a therapist, but not a psychologist if that matters. I used to work in a facility for kids and adolescents with pretty intense behavioral issues. Even when a client was aggressive, I was usually able to de-escalate them and I generally didn't feel unsafe. In fact, most of the time I was concerned about their safety during outbursts. With one exception, I had a client that was pretty strong and prone to intense tantruming. This client was acting in a way that was unsafe, had a plan to seriously hurt another resident I think, so I had to put them on restriction, within staff eyesight at all times. Their response was to run up to me and attempt to choke me. Luckily the staff got there in time and prevented this kid from seriously hurting me. On another occasion, this same client also took apart their curtain rod in their bedroom and swung it at my head. I dodged in time. Oddly enough, this client and I had a pretty good relationship the other 99% of the time, and I generally enjoyed working with them. My brother-in-law is low-functioning autistic and blind. At one point his care provider, who had worked with him for years and knew him quite well, got into a very dangerous situation with him. She had worked with him since he was smaller and had become experienced at interacting safely when he would become angry and aggressive. They had found a good balance of medication for him and she let her guard down. This time though, he was now 20 years old and 6 foot tall. In a split second, he attacked her, jumping up from the couch directly across from her chair. He was very strong and viciously aggressive. I have found myself in tough situations with him, and I'm 6'4" 225 pounds after receiving quite a few blows from his hands, hair torn out and bites on her arms and hands. She was able to push away across the ground and get behind the couch he had been sitting on. She quickly slid the couch into a corner so that he wouldn't have a way around it easily, and she hid herself behind it and tried to be very quiet. He searched that corner of the room for over an hour, following the front and side edges of the couch with his hands, back and forth pacing until he eventually lost interest and went to play with some toys off in the corner of the room. She got out of the corner and ran for her door just as her assistant was coming to remind her that she had gone over the allotted time. My Bill is an amazing guy and I've had some awesome experiences with him over the years, but the idea of being hunted by sound like that is pretty freaky. Obligatory, not a psychologist, but I used to work as an aide in a special education classroom in a middle school. The year I started, a majority of my workload was 8th grade boys and 2 of them had deeply troubling behavioral issues. One kid assaulted a girl in his class. At school. In front is a bunch of other kids. He actually got arrested for it, but the school couldn't expel him because of his disability. For the rest of the year, he was forbidden from being anywhere, including the lunchroom, with her. I spent a lot of time essentially babysitting this kid. And because he didn't give a fuck about school, he did practically nothing during his time in the resource room. The last I heard, he'd been arrested again for breaking into someone's house and stealing a handgun. But the one who scared me was completely antisocial, to the point of threatening to hurt himself or others when a field trip or school assembly was coming up. We eventually had to tell his parents in advance so they wouldn't bring him to school. He talked about death constantly, all while extremely medicated, so it was a very muted, mumbled, and done through a 1,000-yard stare with spittle coming from his mouth. One of the teachers was pregnant. She wasn't his teacher, but he knew who she was, and one day he asked me would Mrs. X's baby live if someone ran her over in a car? I told him I didn't know and tried to change the subject. Then he asked what if someone cut her stomach open? What if they stabbed her? What if she had been dead for a while and no one found her? This really freaked me out, and I had to report it to the SPED teacher. When I told her, she said he had asked her and other students the same thing and scared the shit out of them. She said the pregnant teacher had been advised to avoid him, in case he did or said anything to upset her. Once when I was a medical student I was asked to see a patient in the psychiatric unit of the emergency room. I walked in with my short white coat and clipboard and asked the guy what brought him in today and what was wrong. He looked me dead in the eyes with foamy saliva dribbling from the corner of his mouth and a strange smell in the air and said the devil told me to kill you and kill myself. He was sweaty and his eyes were bloodshot and his wife beater had dark red/brown stains on it. The door was behind him and I wasn't sure I could make it there before something bad happened. No idea if he had a weapon on him. Was afraid of calling loudly for help. I was in a quiet corner of the ER and I felt like I would have had to yell to get attention and I didn't want to startle him. I stayed there for a half hour and asked him more questions. Slipped out when he started to look sleepy. Not a psych, but I worked with parolees for a while as my first job. There was one guy that still sends shivers up my spine whenever I think about him. He came in straight from court and sometimes we didn't receive the details of the offenses before we met with them. This was one of those times. I called him into the office and started going through his paperwork, rules and restrictions of his order, how often he had to report, etc. He started requesting a male officer and stated that he hated females and got along better with men because they understood him. At this point, I still didn't know what he had done to be on parole and he did not want to disclose anything. He spent about 30 minutes talking about how he was the victim of the crime and that females had it out for him. He was very hostile and kept looking at me with a disgusted look and sat with his arms crossed. The paperwork finally came through about an hour into the meeting. He was on for some very serious and disgusting offenses against females. I then let him know that I had received the paperwork and asked him to discuss what had happened. We were asked to get their version of events. It was like something switched and he suddenly became very happy and almost proud of what he had done. He kept standing up and acting out what he had done in detail while smiling the whole time and asking me what I thought of it all. Without going into detail about his offenses, it was very graphic and hard to hear, and the fact that he appeared to be so proud of it was just chilling. He also kept asking whether I thought he was the victim of the crime and at one point asked me if I had any contact numbers for victim compensation for himself. Towards the end of the meeting, he was trying to charm me and kept asking me what time I was finishing work and whether I was parked nearby. I left with a group of my colleagues that day. He ended up back in jail about a month later and while I am all for rehabilitation of offenders, I sincerely hope he stays in there. I'm a farm worker. The grandson of the guy I worked for was off the charts crazy. The grandparents couldn't control him. They bought him a .22 rifle. It had a trigger lock. They gave him the key and some ammunition. I locked it away because he was 6 years old. He threatened to shoot me so I put him in timeout. He shit on the floor and laughed like a crazy asshole. I came to find out it was his sister's rifle I took away, because a few hours later he came outside with his rifle trigger lock off bolt in and ammunition in his pocket to kill me for taking away his sister's gun. Every day I had to deal with something like this. I have seen other workers chasing this 6-year-old kid with hammers. He was batshit crazy. I have many stories about that year. I warned him to stop playing on the roof of a tractor, he would get hurt and I am not there to watch that bullshit. He starts to get down and just seemed to flop down on purpose, landed stomach first on the back of the tractor. It would have hurt so bad. He cried for about 20 seconds, then cackled with laughter. He probably broke ribs, and I saw massive bruises on his stomach when he lifted his shirt to check for cuts. I watched him kill baby chickens by first saying how cute and petting them, then standing on them. He tortured the farm dog to the point it growled when he went near, and one point I actually had to stop the dog from killing him. It had him by the back of the neck and was chomping down. He was crying, then burst into laughter. I can't speak enough about this kid to convey the frustration he would cause. He scared me, and I was on a farm where aggressive black Angus bulls were a daily thing. Everyone hated that kid, and I am relieved I'm not around him anymore. Hess coming your way, psychologists. Worked in a mental health facility for children for 6 months. Saddest 6 months of my life. Top 3 shocking things that happened were: severely schizophrenic 16-year-old teenage boy who was around 5 feet tall, 90 pounds, would get put into a straitjacket during one of his episodes, and he could physically take down the 6'3" 230 pounds male tech, while being in a straitjacket. He would speak in voices that almost sounded demonic while doing it. It was horrifying. Severely schizophrenic 17-year-old girl would hide in a corner, wait till her targeted worker would walk by, stick her hands down the front of her pants into her vagina, grab a handful of period blood, and smack us across the face with the blood. She did this to me more than once, and I had to go to the hospital more than once, during work hours, to get tested, especially when the blood would get close to our mouths and eyes. Very sweet, but very non-verbal 13-year-old boy would masturbate, constantly. Constantly. Pants down, penis out, masturbating, all day, all night, in front of everyone and anyone. He had elephantiasis of his penis and part of one of his legs, so these events were not only disturbing and inappropriate, there was literally a practical problem with him taking his 1.5-foot long penis out of his pants. It seriously took 2 people to pack it back in, and then he would drop his pants and take it out all over again. Not a psychologist, but my brother is. I will not for the life of me tell anyone this guy's name, and my brother told me about it because it kind of messed him up. My brother started his practice, ran from his house, in the same city where I went to college. He worked with this guy who was in my class. We were both econ majors, and I saw him around all the time. He seemed pretty white bread. Wore tees and jeans all the time, headphones in, quiet. Only thing that was weird was he carried a laptop bag/briefcase in addition to his backpack. He started seeing my brother about 2 months into freshman year. He came in for depression, and went through some basic stuff. He didn't feel like he fit in, he didn't know how to talk to people. My brother said this all felt very rehearsed to him. Like, he seemed to be rattling it off from memory. After a few sessions, things changed. The guy says he sees things. He said he can't stand being alone in dark rooms. His roommate moved out of his dorm, so it made it worse. He said he sees things move when he's in the dark. Small, almost imperceptible movements in the corner of his eye. He says he is scared all the time at night. This worried my brother, because before then, it was just depression. Paranoia wasn't a good sign, and he started to think this guy was schizophrenic. The movements apparently got worse. Around late November, this guy started calling my brother's work phone, which happened to be a cell that my brother kept on him at night. 2 a.m., almost like clockwork, this guy would call. Because my brother was afraid this guy's state might deteriorate, he answered the first ones. He said it was awful. His voice was strained, this guy was barely whispering into the phone, he could hear the guy crying. It went on like this for days. Eventually it got to the point where my brother, at their next in-person meeting, told him he needed to take off second semester and seriously consider inpatient care, and that he needed to focus on other patients. He referred him to a health center, and another psychologist who was more experienced with serious cases. This guy cried in his office after being told that. He cried and apologized for over an hour, and he just kept saying, "I'm so fucking scared." I never saw this guy after holiday break. My brother has a few more meetings with him, and he agreed to an inpatient care center after a talk with his parents. 4 months later. It is April, my brother starts seeing lights outside his window at weird times. Not car lights, but like, flashlights. He figured it was just drunk college kids being insensitive. One night he hears knocking on his door, like quick slams, but he ignores it. That same night he gets a call, and he has since changed his policy for late night calls, and he ignores it. It's the guy. He is screaming into the phone, "They're back. They're back. They're back," and he says it faster and faster until he starts crying on speaker, and he says on the message, "I'm outside, please let me in, please." Before the message ends you can hear him slamming on my brother's front door. The guy didn't talk to my brother after that. He committed suicide 3 months later, we found out. Clinical psychologist in training here. I've never been afraid, but my friend had a client once who made her extremely uncomfortable. Without revealing any information that could break confidentiality, I will say that he had issues with masturbating too much, and not doing much else, and at one point asked my friend if they could watch porn together in the next session so he could show her what he does. At another time, he talked about his masturbation habits while touching his dick through his pants a bit, totally inappropriate behavior, obviously. This client had lots of other issues, but when these things came up, her supervisor took her off the case because it wasn't suitable for training and my friend didn't feel safe. I'm not a psychologist, but I have 2 psych degrees and have been in and out of psychiatric wards since my late teens. For 14 years I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. So, as you can imagine, I've seen my fair share of frightening behavior. But nothing scared me more than nannying for a 5-year-old boy with autism and a mood disorder. He had just been released from the hospital where he had stayed for a month to get acclimated to behavioral meds. But in the short 2 weeks I nannied for him, I feared for my life. He would kick, bite, scratch, hit, spit, come after me with knives, punch cars, scream loud enough for neighbors to think he was being abused, and destroyed his mother's picture-perfect apartment. And when I tried to tell his mom that he needed more help than a babysitter could give him, she fired me saying I was wrong and that he just needs someone more attentive. Complete denial. Not a psychiatrist or psychologist, RN on acute psych unit. I've had a few, but one that really stands out was a young and rather built fella. Perfect example of a sociopath, charming when he wanted something, zero capacity for empathy, lack of remorse, very manipulative. If you've seen the movie American Psycho, he nailed the role of Patrick Bateman. I won't give out too much information because I love my job and want to keep it, but anywho. Just very cold, and I've never seen such an evil and malicious smile. Had that grin on his face seconds before assaulting a staff member.